Hello, and welcome to the Intuitive Ouija. Thanks for clicking on my story. Before we begin, drop your city or country in the comments. I'm curious where in the world you're listening from. It was Leo's idea, of course. It was always Leo's idea. Born from some arcane corner of the internet, where folklore bled into conspiracy theory, and the artifacts of forgotten religions were sold for Bitcoin on the dark web. And he presented it to us with the solemn pride of a master architect unveiling his magnum opus, his eyes gleaming with a fervor that was part genuine intellectual curiosity and part the simple, unadulterated joy of convincing his deeply skeptical friends to do something profoundly stupid. "It's not just a board," he'd said, his voice a low, conspiratorial whisper that seemed to swallow the comfortable sounds of my apartment. The hum of the refrigerator, the distant sigh of traffic 10 stories below. It's a system, a perfect, self-contained system of protection and communication, a filtered channel straight into the static. The board itself was a thing of stark, unsettling beauty, a solid rectangle of pure Himalayan salt, heavy and cool as a tombstone, its translucent, pinkish crystalline surface catching the soft lamplight and fracturing it into 1,000 tiny, glimmering prisms. It felt ancient and new all at once, like a geological specimen polished for a ritual, and the letters and numbers and the simple yes and an O and goodbye were carved into its surface with a jeweler's precision, deep and sharp, edged. The planchette, a smaller, heart-shaped piece from the same solid block, was just as meticulously formed, its surface smooth and cool against my skin when Leo first placed it in my hands, its weight both reassuring and strangely ominous. "Salt is the great purifier," Leo explained, his fingers tracing the edge of the board with something akin to reverence. "It's the barrier. It's what keeps the bad stuff out. It's why we throw it over our shoulders and line our doorways with it. Any entity we contact will be filtered through this crystalline lattice, its intentions clarified, its malevolence neutralized before it can even reach us. We're not just opening a door. We're building a door with a screen, so we can see what's on the other side without letting the flies in." Sarah, ever the pragmatist, had rolled her eyes but couldn't hide the flicker of intrigue in her expression, the way she always did when Leo's eccentricities tipped over into something that felt like genuine, tangible magic. "So we're going to talk to ghosts using a giant piece of rock salt," she'd said, a smirk playing on her lips. "And the only thing we have to worry about is high blood pressure?" But even she had fallen silent when Leo lit the candles, killing the overhead light and plunging the living room into a pool of shifting, dancing shadows that clung to the corners of the room like tar. The four of us, Leo, Sarah, me, and Chloe, who was already looking pale and clutching her glass of wine like a lifeline, gathered around my wooden dining table, the salt board glowing with an internal fire in the candlelight. The air grew still and thick, the way it does before a summer storm, and the familiar sounds of the city outside seemed to recede, muffled by an invisible blanket, leaving us in a bubble of tense anticipation. I remember the initial touch of my fingertips on the smooth, cool surface of the planchette, the slight pressure as we all placed our hands upon it, Leo and Sarah on either side, Chloe and I completing the circle, a collective, unspoken agreement to play along, to surrender to the theater of the moment, to see what, if anything, would happen. For the first few minutes, nothing did. The planchette sat motionless under our collective, barely their pressure, a dead weight on the glowing board, and the only sound was Chloe's nervous, shallow breathing and the faint crackle of the candle wicks. "Is anyone there?" Leo asked, his voice unnaturally loud in the hush, his tone not one of spooky melodrama but of genuine, focused inquiry. "We are here to communicate." A long, empty minute passed, and I felt a prickle of foolishness, the familiar sensation of adult children playing a game they'd long outgrown. But then, just as I was about to suggest we pack it in and order a pizza, there was a tremor, a tiny, almost imperceptible shudder that ran through the planchette and up into my fingertips, a vibration so subtle it could have been the collective micro-tremors of our own muscles, a shared physiological echo. But it wasn't. The movement started slowly, a lazy, drifting slide across the smooth salt surface, as if pushed by a weak, curious tide, and it moved with a jerky, uncertain gait to the yes carved in the upper left corner. Chloe let out a tiny, sharp gasp, and Sarah's eyes widened, her smirk vanishing, replaced by a look of intense concentration. "Okay," Leo said, a note of excitement tightening his voice. "Okay. Hello. Can you tell us your name?" The planchette hesitated, then began to move again, sliding in a slow, deliberate path from letter to letter, and I followed its journey, my heart starting a slow, heavy drumbeat in my chest. It spelled out a single word, Anna. A simple name, a harmless name. "Hello, Anna," Leo said, his voice soft, encouraging. "How are you? Can you tell us about your state?" The movement was faster this time, more confident, sliding to a different part of the board. It spelled out cured. A strange word. Not dead, not at peace, but cured. Like an illness had been remedied. "Cured," Sarah whispered, her skepticism momentarily replaced by confusion. "Cured of what?" The planchette didn't move for a long moment, then it slid back to yes, and held there, as if that were answer enough. Leo pressed on. "Are you safe? Are you saved?" The response was immediate, gliding smoothly across the crystalline surface. Saved. The words felt benign, even positive, but a cold knot was beginning to form in my stomach, a primitive warning system that had nothing to do with logic. The entity, Anna, felt less like a lost soul and more like a patient, a convalescent, and the salt board felt less like a filter and more like a container. It was then that I first noticed the moisture, a faint, sticky dampness on my fingertips where they pressed against the planchette. The room was warm from the candles and our close proximity, and a fine sheen of sweat had broken out on my forehead, a completely normal physiological response. But this felt different, a slight tackiness, a granular sensation that hadn't been there before. I dismissed it as psychosomatic, a trick of the mind under pressure, and focused back on Leo's questions. "Where are you, Anna?" he asked. The planchette moved, but this time its path was different. It didn't glide with its earlier smoothness, but dragged with a faint, gritty resistance, leaving behind a barely visible, damp trail on the salt surface, a ghostly smear that evaporated almost instantly. It spelled out, "Here." The air in the room seemed to grow heavier, colder, the candle flames flickering as if in a draft that none of us could feel, and a strange, sharp odor tickled my nostrils, the smell of the ocean on a cold, barren shore, of ozone and something else, something metallic and ancient, like the scent of old coins or blood. "It's getting cold," Chloe murmured, her voice trembling, and she was right. A deep, penetrating chill was seeping into the room, a cold that clung to the bones and had nothing to do with the thermostat. "Our Ouija board is made of salt," I thought, the realization dawning with a slow, sickening clarity, "and our sweat is dissolving it." The heat and moisture from our hands, the very instruments of our contact, were eroding the board, minute particle by minute particle. I looked at the planchette in the flickering light and saw that its sharp, heart-shaped edges were no longer crisp. They were softening, blurring, like an ice cube beginning to melt, and the surface under our fingers was no longer smooth, but was becoming slightly pitted, porous. "Leo," I said, my own voice sounding thin and strained, "maybe we should stop." But Leo was enthralled, his scientific curiosity now fully ignited. "Just a few more questions. Anna, what year is it for you?" The planchette jerked into motion, this time with a force that felt aggressive, no longer a gentle push, but a determined shove, grinding against the dissolving salt surface with a sound like fine sandpaper, a low, gritty whisper that set my teeth on edge. It spelled out a string of numbers that made no sense. 3-7-1-0-0 BC. A date from a time before dates, a number from a depth of history that was terrifying in its immensity. The entity on the other side was not a recent ghost, not a Victorian child or a Civil War soldier. It was something immeasurably older. And it had lied. It had given us a sweet, simple name. Anna. A mask. The planchette, now visibly smaller, its shape distorting, didn't pause. It moved again, the message coming through in broken, grinding strokes as the salt prison walls grew thin. Not Anna. The cold was intense now, a winter-deep freeze that made our breath plume in the candlelight. and the briny metallic smell was so strong it coated the back of my throat. The candle flames guttered wildly, their light dying down to blue embers at the wicks, casting long, distorted shadows that writhed on the walls like things alive. Chloe was crying silently, tears cutting tracks through the sheen of cold sweat on her cheeks, and Sarah's face was a mask of stark terror, her knuckles white where she gripped the table edge. The spirit that had said it was cured and saved was now screaming its truth without moving the planchette at all, its voice a raw, psychic roar that echoed directly inside our skulls, a cacophony of forgotten languages and screams of rage from a million dead throats, a sound of continents breaking and ancient seas boiling away. It was not cured, it had been contained. The salt wasn't a filter, it was the lid on the jar, and our warm, living hands were diligently unscrewing it. The planchette, now a melted, amorphous lump of wet salt, was almost gone, a slick, briny paste covering our fingers, the board itself becoming a shallow, dissolving basin, the letters warping and running into each other like text on a wet page. With a final, violent surge of energy that felt like an electric shock shooting up our arms, the last of the salt planchette slid, or was flung, across the ruined board, carving a deep, liquid furrow through the melting crystal. It spelled out 3 words, each letter a struggle against its own dissolution, a triumphant, screaming declaration that was both inside and outside my head. I am free. The moment the final E was carved, the last of the salt planchette disintegrated completely into a pool of murky, briny water that spread across the table, soaking into the wood. The candles snuffed out simultaneously, plunging us into an absolute, suffocating darkness that was colder than the void between stars, a darkness that felt alive, predatory, and ancient, and in that infinite black silence, I felt a presence, vast and hungry and free, turn its attention towards us. The silence that followed was not a silence at all, but a vacuum, an absolute negation of sound so profound that it felt like a physical pressure against my eardrums, a screaming emptiness that was somehow louder than the entity's final, psychic roar, and in that thick, frigid blackness, the only thing I was aware of was the frantic, animal hammering of my own heart against my ribs, a trapped bird beating itself to death in a cage of bone. I couldn't see my own hand in front of my face. The darkness was so complete, a tangible substance that clung to my skin like oil, and the cold had deepened to a polar intensity, searing my lungs with each ragged, panicked breath I managed to draw, the air itself feeling sharp and crystalline, as if I were inhaling shattered glass. Next to me, Chloe let out a choked, wet sound, a sob of pure, unadulterated terror that was quickly stifled, as if she had clapped a hand over her own mouth to keep the fear from pouring out. And from across the table I heard Sarah whisper, "Oh God, oh God, oh God," a desperate, rhythmic mantra that did nothing to ward off the palpable, suffocating presence that now filled the room, a presence that felt like a mountain of ancient, malevolent stones slowly settling its weight upon us, crushing the air from our chests. Leo was silent, and his silence was the most terrifying thing of all. The architect of this catastrophe, the confident guide, had been rendered mute, and I could almost feel the shape of his shock and dawning, horrific comprehension in the blackness beside me. The briny metallic smell had intensified, becoming the stench of a deep ocean trench, of things that had never seen the sun decaying under immense pressure, and it was mixed now with the sharp, coppery tang of blood, though I couldn't tell if it was real or just a phantom scent conjured by my own terror. I wanted to move, to scream, to flip on the light switch and shatter this awful reality, but my body was frozen, locked in a state of primal paralysis, every muscle fiber screaming at me to flee but utterly incapable of obeying the command, my limbs heavy and numb as if submerged in ice water. This was the moment of release we had foolishly engineered, the thrilling climax of our little game. And now we were stranded in its aftermath, blind and helpless in the presence of something we could not comprehend, something that had been waiting in the dark for an eternity, patient and hateful, and we had been the ignorant, sweaty-handed janitors who had finally, meticulously cleaned its cage. Time seemed to have lost all meaning, stretching and distorting in the absolute dark. It could have been 10 seconds or 10 minutes that we sat there, trapped in that frozen tableau. But then the presence shifted, not a physical movement but a change in the atmosphere, a focusing of its attention, and I felt a wave of pure, undiluted malice wash over me. A hatred so ancient and profound it felt like a physical blow. A hatred for the light, for life, for the very warmth of our fragile, temporary bodies. And then it spoke, not with the grinding, mechanical spelling of the planchette, and not with the psychic roar of its release, but with a voice that seemed to be composed of the darkness itself, a dry, rasping whisper that came from every corner of the room at once. A sound like stone grinding against stone, like the rustling of a million desiccated insect wings. "Thank you," it whispered, and the words were not gratitude but a gloating, a monstrous satisfaction that curdled the air. The voice was inside my head, scraping against the inside of my skull, but it was also outside, a vibration in the very fabric of the room. I felt a warm trickle run from my nose down to my lip, and when I touched it with a tongue that felt like sandpaper, I tasted the distinct, metallic flavor of blood. From Chloe's direction came a sharp, involuntary gasp, and I knew she had heard it too. The words meant for all of us a collective indictment. The entity was not just free, it was savoring its freedom, and we were the first course of its feast. The darkness seemed to coalesce then, to thicken directly in front of me, and a new sensation began to bloom in the freezing air. A sensation of being watched by 1,000 hungry eyes, of being assessed, measured, and found wanting. The pressure in the room increased, a weight pushing down on my shoulders, forcing the air from my lungs in a painful wheeze. And I could hear the wooden table beneath the puddle of brine that was once our protection begin to groan, the wood fibers straining and cracking under an unimaginable force. I knew, with a certainty that bypassed all thought and went straight to the lizard brain at my core, that if I did not move, if we did not break this spell, we would die there, our bodies crushed and frozen in the dark, and the thing we had released would move on into the world, wearing our deaths as its first victory. With a Herculean effort that felt like tearing my own muscles from the bone, I forced my right hand to move, my fingers scrabbling blindly across the wet, sticky surface of the table, through the cold, gritty slurry of dissolved salt, searching for anything, a candle, a glass, a weapon. My fingertips brushed against the cool, smooth cylinder of Sarah's wine glass, and I closed my hand around it, the stem feeling impossibly fragile in my grip. I didn't have a plan. I had only a desperate, screaming need to shatter the silence, to create a spark, to do something to fight back against the crushing, sentient dark. I flung the glass with all my remaining strength in the direction of the living room window, towards the distant, muffled lights of the city that now felt like a memory from another lifetime. The sound of shattering glass was cataclysmic, a sharp, crystalline explosion that seemed to tear a rent in the fabric of the oppressive silence. For a single, heart-stopping second, nothing happened. The darkness and the cold and the presence remained, absolute and unchallenged, and I felt a wave of utter despair wash over me. But then, as if the sound had broken a spell, the emergency lights in the hallway outside my apartment door flickered on, casting a thin, sliver of sickly yellow light under the door, and in that faint, almost negligible illumination, I saw the thing that the darkness had been hiding. It had no form, no shape that my eyes could properly register, but it cast a shadow, a distortion in the air above the table, a shimmering, malevolent haze that seemed to drink the light, a patch of deeper darkness that hinted at impossible angles and a vast, unthinkable scale, a shadow that was not the absence of light, but the presence of something that devoured it. The sight lasted only a fraction of a second before the hallway light sputtered and died, plunging us back into blackness. But it was burned into my retina, an image of pure anti-creation. The entity let out a sound then that I will hear on my deathbed, a sound of fury and amusement, a hissing, multi-throated laugh that felt like needles being driven into my brain. The pressure in the room vanished abruptly, and the crushing cold began to recede, not warming but simply withdrawing, pulling back like a tide, taking the stench of the deep ocean with it. The normal sounds of the city, a siren in the distance, the hum of the elevator shaft, rushed back in, shockingly loud and mundane, and the familiar ambient light from the window, previously blotted out, now faintly illuminated the room once more. We sat there, the three of us, for what felt like an eternity, shivering uncontrollably in the aftermath, covered in a film of cold sweat and briny salt residue. The puddle on the table the only physical evidence of what had transpired. The salt board was gone, completely dissolved, leaving behind a white, crystalline stain etched into the wood grain. A ghostly impression of the alphabet and the words yes, N-O, and the final triumphant goodbye that we had never gotten to say. Leo finally moved, his chair scraping back with a jarringly normal sound, and he stumbled towards the light switch, flicking it on. The sudden, harsh fluorescent light was blinding, a brutal assault that revealed the wreckage of the evening. Our pale, terrified faces, the tears streaking through the grime on Chloe's cheeks, the shattered glass glittering on the floor by the window, and the empty, stained space on the table where our hubris had once sat enshrined in pink crystal. No one spoke. There were no words adequate for what we had experienced, for what we had done. We had not had a conversation with a ghost. We had performed an exorcism in reverse. We had not opened a door. We had broken down the wall of a dam. The entity was gone from my apartment, that much was certain. The oppressive weight, the sentient cold, the whispering voice, they had vanished. But they had not ceased to exist. They were simply elsewhere. The thing that had called itself Anna, that had pretended to be cured and saved, was now free. And the world outside my window, with its 10 million unsuspecting lights, had just become infinitely darker, infinitely more dangerous, and we were the only three people who knew it, our knowledge a crushing, secret burden that I carry with me every second of every day, a constant, screaming reminder that our Ouija board was made of salt, and our sweat dissolved it, and the spirit said it was cured and saved. And now it's free. The days that followed were a blur of a terrible, fragile normalcy, a pantomime of life performed by hollowed-out actors who jumped at the sound of their own shadows. The three of us moving through our routines with the stunned, mechanical gait of survivors of a bomb blast. Our shared secret a corrosive acid eating away at the foundations of everything we thought we knew. We didn't discuss it, not really. We would meet for coffee, our hands trembling slightly as we lifted the cups. Our conversations a brittle exchange of pleasantries that would inevitably falter into long, strained silences, our eyes darting towards any sudden movement, any unexpected shift in the light, any faint, cold draft that might whisper of its return. Leo, the once proud architect of our damnation, was a broken man, his intellectual curiosity replaced by a deep, haunted shame. He spent hours in the library, buried in ancient texts on demonology and containment rituals, his face growing gaunt, his eyes shadowed with a desperation that was painful to witness. But his research was a futile attempt to close a barn door after the horse had not only bolted, but burned the barn to the ground and salted the earth behind it. Sarah became brittle and sharp, her pragmatism curdling into a kind of furious denial. She would snap at us if we so much as mentioned the word salt, insisting it was a shared hallucination, a mass hysteria induced by suggestion and candlelight, but I could see the terror lurking just beneath the surface of her anger. The way she would compulsively check the locks on her doors 4 times before bed, the way she flinched at the sound of the ocean in a seashell. And Chloe, poor Chloe fared the worst. She stopped leaving her apartment altogether, her once vibrant spirit crushed into a paranoid agoraphobia. She called me late at night, her voice a thin, reedy whisper on the phone, saying she could hear scratching inside the walls, a dry, scaly sound like stone grinding against stone, and that her tap water had started to taste brackish, like the briny puddle left on my table. I tried to reassure her, to parrot Sarah's lines about stress and suggestion, but the words felt like ashes in my mouth because I was hearing things too, not scratches, but whispers, faint, sibilant echoes on the very edge of hearing that would vanish the moment I turned my head, whispers that carried the same dry, rasping quality as the voice that had thanked us in the dark. The world itself began to feel subtly wrong, tilted on its axis, the colors a little less vibrant, the air a little thinner, as if a fundamental nutrient had been leached from reality. I started seeing things out of the corner of my eye, swift, darting shadows that were gone when I looked directly at them. Shadows that seemed to have too many angles, that moved with a fluid, alien grace that was utterly unlike the silhouette of a person or an animal. The news, which I watched with a new, obsessive dread, began to report on a series of strange occurrences, small, inexplicable events that would have been dismissed as curiosities before but now felt like ominous tremors. A municipal water tower in a neighboring town was found to be filled not with water, but with a thick, brine-like sludge that stank of the sea. An entire block of historic brownstones was evacuated due to a sudden, pervasive cold that no engineer could diagnose, a cold that froze the pipes and left frost on the inside of the windows in the height of summer. A respected cardiologist was discovered by his wife, standing catatonic in their living room. His pupils dilated into black pools, muttering the same phrase over and over again in a dead language no one could identify. The phrase that linguists later tentatively translated as "I am cured." Each report was a fresh spike of ice in my veins, a confirmation that the thing we had released was not content to simply exist in its freedom. It was exploring, testing the limits of its new playground, leaving its mark upon the world in ways that were both subtle and monstrous. The entity was not a ghost haunting a single location. It was a virus, an idea, a fundamental wrongness seeping into the cracks of our reality, and we were patient zero. The guilt was a physical weight, a stone in my gut that made it hard to breathe. The knowledge that every strange cold snap, every case of unexplained madness, every aberrant event was a direct consequence of our stupidity, our arrogant belief that we could control forces we did not understand. I stopped sleeping, haunted by dreams of vast, lightless depths and a whispering, grinding voice that promised not death, but an eternity of containment, of being walled up alive in salt while the world outside went mad. I would wake up gasping, my sheets soaked with a cold sweat that smelled faintly of the ocean, my fingers tingling with the remembered grit of the dissolving planchette. 2 weeks after the incident, Leo showed up at my door unannounced, his face a mask of grim resolve. He didn't say hello, just pushed past me into the apartment, clutching a large, leather-bound book to his chest like a shield. "It's getting stronger," he said, his voice raw, and I didn't need to ask what he meant. He opened the book on my kitchen table, its pages brittle and covered in dense, spidery script and diagrams that made my head ache to look at. "It wasn't a spirit, it wasn't a demon in any conventional sense," he whispered, his finger tracing a symbol that looked like a spiral of chains breaking. "The texts, the oldest ones, they talk about things that existed before the concepts of good and evil, entities of pure negation that were bound at the dawn of time by the first laws, the fundamental principles of the universe. Salt wasn't just a purifier, it was a primal symbol of preservation, of stasis. It didn't purify the entity, it held it in a state of permanent, unchanging suspension. We didn't summon it, we thought it." He looked at me, his eyes wide with a terror that mirrored my own. "And it's not just stretching its legs. It's hunting. It's looking for something. Or someone." The phone rang then, shrill and insistent, shattering the tense silence. I picked it up, my hand shaking, and heard Chloe's voice, but it was wrong, flat and toneless, devoid of the panic that had characterized her recent calls. "It's here," she said, the words devoid of inflection. "It's in the walls. It's showing me things. It says it wants to thank me properly. It says it's almost time for the curing to begin." The line went dead. Leo and I stared at each other for a heartbeat of pure, undiluted horror. And then we were moving, scrambling for our coats, our car keys, driven by a desperate, shared understanding that we were already too late, that the thing we had unleashed had chosen its first proper victim, and that our presence would likely only add more fuel to its terrible, ancient hunger. The drive to Chloe's apartment was a nightmare journey through a city that now seemed alien and threatening. Every flickering streetlight a malevolent eye, every shadowy alleyway a potential mouth. We ran up the stairs to her door, ignoring the elevator, our footsteps echoing like gunshots in the sterile hallway, and I hammered on the wood, shouting her name. There was no answer, but the door was unlocked. It swung open silently on well-oiled hinges, revealing Chloe's dark apartment. The air that washed out was frigid and carried that now familiar stench of deep ocean and ozone, so strong it made my eyes water. The only light came from the television, which was tuned to a blaring static screen, the chaotic gray patterns casting a frenetic, strobing light over the living room. And there, in the center of the room, stood Chloe. She was facing away from us, perfectly still, her silhouette outlined by the television's flickering glow. The room was in disarray, furniture overturned, books scattered across the floor, but Chloe was unnervingly calm. "Chloe," Leo said, his voice cracking. She slowly turned around, and I had to choke back a scream. Her face was placid, her eyes open and staring, but they were wrong. The pupils were gone. The entire orb of each eye was a solid, glossy black, like polished obsidian, reflecting the static from the TV in twin, dancing points of light. A faint, serene smile played on her lips. She raised a hand, not in greeting, but in a gesture of benediction, and when she spoke, her voice was not her own. It was a chorus, a layered sound that contained the dry rasp of stone, the hiss of the sea, and the whisper of a million dead things. "Do not be afraid," the thing wearing Chloe said, its head tilting to an impossible angle. "The process has begun, the great curing, the saving from the disease of existence. You will be next. You will all be saved. You will all be at peace." It took a step towards us, and the temperature in the room plummeted further, the static from the television rising to a deafening roar that filled my skull. I saw then that the walls of the apartment were weeping, not with water, but with a thick, saline solution that dripped slowly to the floor, and I knew, with a certainty that froze the very marrow in my bones, that our fate was no longer a question of if, but when. The entity was free, and it was just getting started. The thing that wore Chloe's face like an ill-fitting mask took another step, its movement a fluid, grotesque parody of human gait, the joints seeming to bend in ways that screamed of broken puppetry, and the serene smile never wavered, a horrifying contrast to the void of its eyes that drank the frantic light from the static-filled screen. Leo made a sound beside me, a low, animal moan of pure despair, and he stumbled back, his shoulder hitting the door jamb with a dull thud that seemed to snap something inside of me, breaking the paralytic terror that had rooted me to the spot. This was not a ghost, not a demon to be reasoned with or exorcised. This was a force of nature, an anti-creation, and it was using my friend as a mouthpiece, as a workshop for its terrible curing. "Run!" I gasped, the word barely more than a choked exhalation, but Leo was already moving, his survival instinct overriding his shock. I turned to follow, my limbs feeling like lead, but a voice, Chloe's voice twisted by that unholy chorus, stopped me cold. "There is no running from wellness," it said, the words dripping with a paternal, condescending kindness that was more terrifying than any scream. "The sickness of being must be purged. We will scour you clean. We will make you still." I risked a glance back and saw the Chloe thing standing in the center of the room, its arms now outstretched, and the weeping walls began to weep faster, the briny fluid streaming down in sheets, pooling on the floor, and beginning to creep towards us with a sinister, purposeful slither. The static from the television seemed to pulse in time with my hammering heart, a deafening rhythm of chaos that promised annihilation. I fled, slamming the apartment door shut behind me, the sound unnaturally loud in the hallway, a pathetic attempt to barricade a horror that I knew could not be contained by wood and locks. Leo was already at the stairwell, his face a pale, sweat-sheened mask of panic, and we took the stairs 2 and 3 at a time, our footsteps echoing in the concrete enclosure like the beats of a frantic drum signaling a retreat from an unwinnable war. We didn't speak until we were in my car, the engine roaring to life, the familiar interior feeling like the most flimsy of sanctuaries. "What do we do?" Leo whispered, his hands gripping the dashboard so tightly his knuckles were white. "What the hell do we do?" I had no answer. The protocols of horror movies, priests, holy water, salt circles, felt like childish fantasies now. We hadn't let a ghost in. We had dismantled the fence around a tiger that had been starving for millennia, and it had just tasted its first real meal. We drove aimlessly for hours, through the neon-lit canyons of the city that now seemed like a graveyard waiting to be filled. The lights of a million windows, each feeling like a potential eye, a potential mouth for the thing we had unleashed. Every pedestrian shuffling in the cold, every driver in a neighboring car, seemed like a potential vessel, their humanity a thin veneer over a waiting, saline emptiness. The entity wasn't just in Chloe's apartment, it was in the water, in the air, in the very concept of cold. It was everywhere and nowhere, a spreading stain on reality. We ended up back at my place as the first gray light of dawn stained the sky, a dawn that felt like a lie, the sun a distant, feeble bulb unable to penetrate the new, profound darkness that had settled over the world. We didn't sleep. We sat in my living room, the space where it had all begun, and watched the news with a morbid, terrified fascination. The reports were escalating. A sudden, localized blizzard had hit the financial district, freezing commuters in their tracks, the snow reportedly tasting of salt. Several patients in a psychiatric ward were found comatose, their bodies hypothermic despite the warm room, a faint, crystalline rime coating their skin, all of them whispering the same phrase in their catatonic state: saved. The anchorwoman's voice was tight with a professional concern that could not mask her own growing confusion and fear. The world was starting to notice the tremors, even if they didn't understand the earthquake that was causing them. Leo finally broke the silence, his voice hollow. It's curing the world. It's saving us from the fever of life by making everything still and cold and dead. That's what it meant. That's what it wanted all along. The truth of his words settled over me, a shroud of ultimate hopelessness. We hadn't released a monster that would go on a rampage. We had released a principle, a cosmic law of entropy and stasis that viewed life itself as a disease to be remedied. Our attempts to fight, it would be like a cancer cell trying to fight chemotherapy. The phone rang again, and we both jumped. It was Sarah. Her voice was frantic, stripped of all its former skepticism. "It's at my door," she sobbed. "I can hear it scratching, not like an animal, like stone grinding on stone. And it's whispering my name. It's using Chloe's voice. It says it has a place for me. It says it's my turn to be cured." I told her we were coming, the words automatic, a meaningless promise made by a dead man to a dying woman. Leo and I looked at each other, and in his eyes, I saw the same resigned understanding that was in my own. There was no stopping this. There was only witnessing the end, the great, quiet curing of a noisy, vibrant, diseased world. We were the carriers, the ones who had patient zero, and our only remaining purpose was to see the plague through to its final, silent conclusion. As we walked out of my apartment building into the cold morning air, I noticed that the metal handrail was coated with a thin, gritty film of white. I touched it with a trembling finger and brought it to my tongue. It was salt. The curing had already begun, and it was starting with us.